So I'm going to go fairly quickly because I really want to get to our Q&A and sort of a conversation with you more than anything. But I want to do a little bit of an overview about how we're working towards inclusive excellence. I'm going to talk about what do I mean by some of these terms. What are some early areas and opportunities? I'm in this inaugural space for the Vice Deanship for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion about 2 months. So have learned a whole lot and want to sort of share a little bit of what I've learned with you. Talk about opportunities, how, what are the type of things that you are doing, and sort of what are ways that we can sort of work together in terms of sort of moving this forward. So my intention is that for this opportunity here, this isn't one and done. This isn't the first time and the last time we ever have a conversation, but it really is the beginning of our collective conversation on strategies on how to improve so far as diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as I asked you in terms of sort of who you are and where you came from and things like that, it's really important in terms of understanding sort of what is the fire in our belly? What's the passion? What are people? Are you clinician leader, educator, mentor, researcher? Are you a researcher in terms of leading, educating, or administrating? Are you an educational leader? Are you a healthcare administrator? Are you a policy maker or something else? We all have sort of that passion that sort of drives us why we get up every morning. Excellence in all of these areas: clinical, health outcomes, innovation, education, training, all of those things. It's infused in terms of attending to issues about diversity, equity, inclusion. And so all of these things, to go from good to great, need to pay attention that we're getting the talent we need, that everybody's sort of in the program in terms of engaged, and everybody feels connected in terms of our mission for excellence. So diversity is a pretty broad umbrella. We certainly know that there are historically excluded sort of groups that we have to attend to because they're underrepresented in medicine. We know that women in terms of leadership are underrepresented in medicine. And so we have lots of folks in that group. But as we look in terms of diversity, every single one of us brings something to that equation. And the question is, do we see it? Do we engage? Do we celebrate it? And do we use that power of all those sort of perspectives in terms of our daily work? So I shared this picture, and I think that one of the things I've learned by moving to Minnesota, that I think it has to be maybe a hockey game rather than a baseball game. I don't know. I guess we have to have some different things. But in this particular cartoon, and some of you may have seen this already, when we talk about the difference between what is equal and what is equitable, we first have to say, what's the goal? What are we doing here? Okay. And I would submit to you that in this cartoon, these three little individuals, their goal is to see the baseball game and maybe to almost envision what they could be as sort of a future major league baseball player. Right? So that's the goals. So if we agree that that's the goal for these three individuals, then we have to ask, can all three achieve that goal? Well, if we treat every single one the same, each one of them gets a box, we find that the tallest one doesn't really need a box. The second one can now see the game, and the third one still can't, right? So the goal isn't achieved. If we actually address it in terms of what does everybody need to be able to see that game, then we find that by the second picture, everybody has something different, but what that difference does is it makes it be that everybody can sort of have the goal achieved. And the last one, which is we want to work on collectively, which isn't going to be sort of a short thing, but imagine if we had a world where we dismantled that fence. And just as you were, you could actually see the game. That's where, working in terms of those systemic barriers, those deeper things are going to be sort of heading to that. When I use the word inclusion or inclusive environment, I mean things like this: common purpose, meaningful work, respect, trust, structural competence, equitable reward, access to opportunity, appreciation of individual differences, and a sense of belonging. All of those things in terms of what is inclusiveness. I really like this sort of diagram. I love the title. The title says the simply irresistible organization. Wouldn't it be great if we lived in a simply irresistible organization? Look at these things: small empowered teams, time for Slack, cultural recognition, humanistic workplace, high impact learning culture, transparency, honesty, mission, purpose, right? And I suspect for many of you, some of these things are true. How would it be if we could actually have all of those sort of happening? That's an inclusive environment. So we know in terms of events that's happened that issues in medicine needs to change. We've had sort of conversations in terms of how the world maybe wasn't how many of us saw it, and that there were really injustices that we have to sort of address as we move things forward, and we have to come together to be able to do that. And so many groups and many spaces are mobilizing, and I look forward to hearing from you all in terms of some of the changes and some of the innovations you have in terms of your space to sort of recognize and sort of be able to move forward in terms of this issue. We need to do work in inclusive climates for lots of people, including sort of women and BIPOC and first generation and rural and immigrant and LGBT and disabled, disadvantaged, lots of folks in terms of being able to have a space where everybody can be, everyone is valued, and we're able to move things forward in terms of positive change for missions that we care about. So our goals are to identify and enable inclusive excellence in all of the mission domains: research, clinical care, education training, and a productive work environment. Promoting, recruiting talent, equity, and opportunity, engaging all members of the School of Medicine and our School of Medicine community members like you all to improve the quality and impact of our efforts, to find who's doing it right, where are our exemplars, and shine the light on them, and then engage in the spirit of inquiry to look at innovations for health disparities. So the approach that I sort of put forward is kind of a 5-bucket approach. We first start with why we're here, which is mission. We talk about sort of climate and culture within this, what's working, what's not working. Our second bucket is sort of where are these exemplars, the best kept secrets of great things that are happening that we need to know so we can sort of celebrate them. What are the third bucket, which is what's good. With a little work, we can get it to great, so we can improve that. What are gaps, things that are just not happening that we need to have happen? And then the last is sort of troubleshooting. How do we stay inside the lines in terms of doing what we want to? So I'll just share with you in terms of research, and trust me that I could have sort of a whole hour plus. We could probably have a symposium in terms of all the amazing things of inclusive excellence that's happening in terms of the research space. And I suspect during your time here in terms of alumni activities, you're hearing about some of these. You have a leg up very much on me, having sort of trained here. I'm just learning about these for the first time, but it's pretty amazing. It's amazing in terms of opportunities as far as testing, in terms of sort of addressing issues for the COVID crisis, having rapid response grants, looking at innovations in terms of sort of how we do what we do, moving forward in terms of participating in vaccine trials. There's a whole lot that's happening. And what's really very impressive from my perspective, lots and lots of large academic institutions aren't as nimble to respond to current events and current challenges as I've seen here. So there's a lot happening in terms of inclusive excellence. I mentioned in terms of sort of the clinical care piece, we have these rapid response grants in terms of how we can improve health for our various communities. We have a Hope Commission figuring out how, with our clinical partners, we can align so far as our efforts in terms of both talent, equity, and sort of inclusivity and excellence. We've had sort of wonderful stuff in terms of the Kook Clinic with mobile testing in sort of the clinical space. When one of the clinics got smashed right after George Floyd's murder, the very next day, people were in the parking lot giving individuals in the neighborhood food, water, sustenance, and then within a week, they were back in the clinic sort of delivering care. Other clinics, sort of knowing that COVID was shutting things down, made a list of their fragile patients and started reaching out to them even before everything was closed down to make sure that they would sort of be okay throughout. So there's some really excellent things and exemplars we're seeing here in terms of clinical care. Saliva testing in terms of sort of the new thing that's sort of coming out as an opportunity for sort of rapid testing. And the other piece that I found, which I thought was just really cool, one of our family medicine residents reaching out to sort of teens created a TikTok video about how it's cool in terms of wearing a mask. So that just tickled me. And I just thought in terms of when we talk about sort of innovation, it's a really neat thing that all members of our community are engaging. In the education and training space, we have groups of students that are working with administrators and educational leaders to change curriculum that reflects what we need to understand in terms of issues associated with race in medicine, how we need to sort of reform in terms of having inclusive environments. The Task Force for Change is led by our colleagues in terms of the Duluth community that also collaborates with sort of the Twin Cities Medical Education Reform Coalition for that global change. We've named thread leaders on health disparities to really look at the curriculum, very critically in terms of what needs to be taught, in terms of having understanding so far as diverse communities and their needs. And we have ongoing impact from that which you probably very much know of, our Center for American Indian and Minority Health and our rural medicine sort of colleagues. We have in most of our departments specific specialty diversity, equity, inclusion collaborators that's going to work with our emerging Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion to be able to do programming, look at opportunities. We have a special Dean's seminar series that invites guest speakers to come and talk about topics that are important to the institution sort of as a whole, and potentially you as well. As far as community engagement, again, lots of really amazing things. Dr. Critchlow in the Ladders program works with ninth graders and up in terms of sort of mentoring them with students. And I think some of those individuals who came up through that program are now actually in family medicine residency. And so seeing that ladder really sort of going scaffolding all the way up is pretty exciting. We have our colleagues in the program in health disparities research that are looking as well as providing technical support for other people who want to engage in the community. And then certainly in sort of our adolescent space, we have sort of healthy youth development research that's happening, looking at ways to better connect us moving sort of out in the community. So enough about us. We did ask a few questions about you, but really the focus at this point is we need you. We need your insight. We need your needs. We need your support. We need your help to transform medicine and our mission, telling us what you are doing locally in terms of the exemplars so we can shine a light on it. As we change up our webpage and sort of have our communications, we want an opportunity to hear from you in terms of the great things that you're doing. What trainings and sessions might you want that's helpful to your work, to your mission that you're making a change? How can you help us move from words into action, sort of the do of giving time, support, aid for getting talent into medicine, transforming our world to be more equitable, and finding those innovations in research, education, and clinical care outcomes. I'm just curious, I'm sure many of you are already doing this, but I'd love to sort of just, Maureen, can you put a poll up in terms of how many people are mentoring, that they're already sort of engaged in this kind of work so far as identifying talent? Take a minute, let us know sort of what kind of work are you in? With whom do you?
People can select more than one thing as well.
Absolutely.
Give just maybe 10 more seconds.
All right. Okay, so almost everybody, 80% mentor sort of students, 40% residents, then sort of colleagues, and then fellows and others about sort of 20%, right? So everybody is in sort of the mentoring business, shall we say. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for continuing to do what you do. Please know, we want to hear from you, we want to engage with you and sort of understand as we move this forward. When I sort of entered into this position, I said that as the Vice Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, my role is collaborator in chief. And so we, in terms of culture being a learned behavior, we learn from each other and we rise up sort of together. So doing this collectively is the way we sort of get this done to have sort of excellence and inclusion. All right, so now in sort of our Q&As and whatever, please feel free in terms of comments, questions, thoughts. And then Maureen, if you can cue that up for me, or Lindsay, that'd be great.
Yeah, while we're giving people the opportunity to type in their question, I would be interested in knowing, I know you've only been here for 2 months, less than 2 months, but where do you see the biggest opportunities for advancing? We're doing so many things already. Is there anything new that we need to be doing?
I am sort of still in the exploration mode in terms of finding, because it's big space. and issues that are important in terms of research mission are a little bit different in terms of sort of the clinical and sort of the educational ones. I think that there are some areas that are lower hanging fruit than others. Some of the educational changes that we need to empower our students to have an understanding, have a language, realize sort of what is at hand as we sort of create a just medicine environment. I think those are sort of easier in terms of doing that. One of the things that I have found globally is that, in truth, there's a lot of people who care, and that's wonderful. That's incredible. I probably wouldn't be here if there weren't a lot of people who cared. But there's a lot of people who care, and yet they don't necessarily have a language to talk about anti-racism. Lots of good intention, but feel like they're walking on eggshells. And then we have other members that the world is just not safe in terms of sort of going to work every day, and sort of being able to have a connection between sort of those groups of people so that we can kind of work together and say, how are we in this together and what kind of common language can we have? I think that that's an important step. There are a number of groups that are actually doing really interesting activities, from training sessions to book clubs, to really sort of explore topics and gain a better understanding of the life of someone other than themselves, in terms of doing that. And I think that's really important so that we can kind of develop this common ground. And so I think that that's probably the first most important step of sort of how do we actually talk about this, which can be sort of sometimes what feels like a 3 to 5 chili pepper conversation. How do we sort of get these conversations so that we are all together in terms of that common goal to be able to move things forward? But there are individuals, for example, we have new vice chairs and an endowed chair in diversity, equity, inclusion. The vice chair position in the Department of Medicine, that they're looking for a candidate, an endowed chair in diversity, equity, inclusion, and family medicine, and lots of work in terms of community sort of engaged space. And so we have a lot of sort of activities that are happening. I view that sort of sewing them together and having a communication way so that we can see all of these things as well as shine the light on those is incredibly important. I don't want anybody wasting their time reinventing the wheel. And so we're trying to get that information together so that we can sort of do this together. But I think additional trainings, getting an awareness, that's an important first step that we sort of need to do. And then having sort of a common language to promote change is really important. In general, when you work in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it's really, really important, if you're going to do it right, that you both honor that where you came from, but then acknowledge how you need to change to sort of change for the better in terms of excellence, and balancing those things as we go, as well as having every voice matter. And then looking to see who's not even at the table, who we need to recruit to bring their voices in.
Great, thank you so much. We have a comment or question from Dr. June Lavallure. I think she's asking in some ways a little bit, with a smile, but I do think it's actually a valid question. How can we get this message to some of our current politicians? How do we? It's again, it kind of goes to that language, but especially in conversations with people who have the ability to make policy.
It's a great question. I actually think that, I just said a minute ago, we need to make sure our voices count. And so I'm just going to reiterate probably what you've been hearing in lots of different places, which is the way in a democracy that we have every voice count is that everybody votes. And I think that that's the best way in terms of our politicians of understanding sort of our collective will and our expectation about their representing sort of us is that we vote. And I think that, how people sort of come to in terms of who they vote to represent them, that's, they come different ways. But what a vibrant democracy is that we all vote, and then we sort of say, this is the direction we want to move forward. So number one, I think voting is incredibly important. And in general, actually, I think that also includes that if you're in sort of the clinical space, encouraging your patients to vote, not how to vote, but to vote, because the engagement is sort of where the money is in terms of doing that. I think that we need to be more effective collectively as an entity, talking to those who can help us advocate. For most of us, we have specialty societies that represent us. And so rather than just sort of having that email come in from them and say, click delete, figuring out, wait a minute, you have an advocacy arm. How do I get engaged? How do I participate in that? What are the messages that need to be out there? Technically, there are actually sort of training sessions where you can get trained on how to advocate with sort of people in sort of government. And I would say explore those. Because when I did my health services research work, we actually had that training. It was humbling to realize that the person I was going to be communicating to was an early 20-something who spent many hours, but they read volumes and volumes of information that they sort of made into the haiku for their representative, and then said, here's what the issues are, and here's pro and con in terms of voting, and so on and so forth. So when you would advocate, you'd advocate to somebody who potentially was half your age, if not younger. Those individuals were important to sort of engage in terms of that space. So I think that, old-fashioned things like snail mail actually sometimes impacts people in government, saying that their constituency cares about them. But equally on the flip side, getting engaged in terms of Twitter and sort of responsibly communicating in terms of sort of your needs is also sort of another reasonable piece. But I think that physicians need to, and clinicians and researchers need to have a unified voice. I think the way that we've sort of been muted is everybody sort of divided and carved up things. And there isn't sort of like there's yours and yours and yours. There's not an us. And I think if we care about medicine and healthcare, we need to look at sort of organizations and advocate through them, as well as sort of talk to the people that are supposed to represent us and hold them responsible, not just at election time, but afterwards, in terms of saying, we're paying attention, making that be sort of that active piece that we're doing to make sure that sort of our voice is heard. It's a great question. Thank you.
Okay, I noticed a question from Dr. Langer that came through the chat, and she's wondering, are medical students, residents, fellows, and junior staff given opportunities to learn more about medical research design and the IRB process? Now, I don't know if that's speaking generally or if there's research going on in this diversity field, but maybe you can speak to that, Dr. Núñez, and maybe you can't, but we could elaborate.
So if it is within sort of diversity, equity, inclusion space, what I can share with you is that a lot of the medical education reform is happening sort of with medical students, not sort of for them. So I'll give you an amazing example. A bit after sort of George Floyd's murder, there was a session at our Duluth campus, and the medical students said, of the stuff that's happening, there's things that we need to understand about racism in medicine, about police brutality, about violence. Like, there's things we need to understand. And they pitched to sort of the administration that over a weekend where they burned the midnight oil, they crafted a week-long curriculum for the students at that particular campus on some of these issues about implicit bias, about racism, and things like that. It was off the hook, rated really, really highly. And those students then created this task force for change that I mentioned. So we have students that are engaging in terms of doing some of this curricular reform to make it meaningful. In the residency space, I'm a little bit on thinner ice. I've had a chance to talk a little bit with some of the residents, but I'm certainly no expert in terms of what's happening. And I think it really is variable based upon sort of specialty. I think that there are some folks in the field of family medicine, which is sort of community engaged sort of all the time and kind of course, that have been doing some amazing work, both in the research space as well as clinical care delivery with residents engaged. But I think it's variable. I don't know. I can't sort of speak sort of more specifically. To the question about sort of IRB, and I'm thinking that maybe, and you can sort of re-answer in terms of the Q&A or whatever, but perhaps you're sort of asking about, are we paying attention when we talk about sort of beneficence as it comes to sort of infringing on people's rights that we haven't been paying attention to? And I don't know in terms of that. I mean, I'll share with you something that I learned not that long ago, which is, I came from a private institution and this is a land grant institution, right? So people say this is a land grant institution. And like many of us, you hear that word that you think you know that. I mean, I grew up in Pennsylvania, not far from Penn State, which was a land grant institution. So I thought I knew what that meant. But it turns out that land grant has sort of a bit of a nuance. What a land grant institution means is that they got land that often had resources like mining and things like that, and that the money from that land was what funded different colleges. There's a very powerful New York Times article that talks about this. And so some of those funds are, continuing to support different sort of institutions. What we don't sort of talk about is that who do those lands come from? And those lands basically came from Native and Indigenous folks, so that money sort of came from taking the land from those people in terms of doing these things. So it's sort of like, oh, wow, wait a minute, like that's something that's important to know in terms of acknowledging our responsibility in terms of who we are and where we are and how we need to move forward. So when it comes to being responsible in terms of IRB and sort of sensitivity, certainly there's adherence in terms of national guidelines about what we need to do for IRB. But to get to that deeper stuff down in the iceberg in terms of, are we acknowledging where we're from, where this came from, how we need to be, and what beneficence may look like with different populations, working with them in a collaborative way, I don't know whether or not we've gotten to those nuances yet, but it's certainly important work that needs to happen. So hopefully that's helps you in terms of your question. I'm not sure.
Thank you, Dr. Núñez. I actually had a question that I know we will be promoting the Dean's new Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Fund on Give to the Max Day this year, which is coming up here in November. But outside of funding and donor support, what are ways that our alumni can support your team's mission and expanding DEI efforts for our medical school students and the greater medical school population?
Great question. So there's a ton of ways, I'll share with you in terms of, we talk about people that are underrepresented in medicine and some of those barriers, right? So one of the things I often say is it's really easy to get a home run if you're born on third base. It's not so easy if you live 4 miles away and you don't have GPS coordinates to the stadium. And those barriers are real. So I'll give you an example. I ran sort of a graduate pre-med program. And in that program, I had students who came from spaces where they never had, or maybe for a week during their senior year, they had a little something about genetics. And I know that other students who went to fabulous sort of schools got genetics in ninth grade, and when they were 9 years old, in third grade. When you learn immunology for the first time, it is assumed that you understand genetics and what all the terminology are, and are able to sort of use those. So imagine somebody who barely had any exposure and somebody who had it when they were 9 years old. Those advantages matter. Some students can take MCAT preps that can be thousands of dollars, so that they can sort of perform well and be competitive going medical school. Many folks, whether they're first generation or rural or historically excluded, they don't have the resources to do that. So resources can make a difference. For students being able to get registration to go to national and regional meetings, to just meet with you all in terms of your spaces, figuring out ways that there can be scholarships to make it easier to overcome some of those challenges would be incredible. Similarly, and COVID's changed it a little bit in terms of, we don't have medical students traveling from point A to point B and all those travel costs, or residents or fellows, but there's still sort of resources in terms of being able to sort of have access to opportunities. Sometimes people don't even have sort of simple things, which in terms of food insecurities might be sort of stuff to eat as a resource, because at home, if they're sort of at home, their study has to sort of become secondhand to the responsibilities of the family and resources that the family needs. And so having emergency resources where people can sort of reach out and sort of get some help is really an important way in terms of doing that. We want to create sort of additional rapid response grants. One we had already in terms of those health disparities we talked about, and others about sort of innovations on how we can work better and smarter in terms of sort of being more inclusive. So having opportunities to sort of inspire the spirit of inquiry in terms of moving things forward. One of our diversity representatives talked about, she wanted to sort of get funding so that they could buy books for children that included characters who were BIPOC, so that they got to see diverse people while the kids were sort of waiting in the waiting room. So there are so many ways, both small and large, that sort of a contribution can make a difference. It can make a difference in terms of patients. It can make a difference in terms of our residents. It can make a difference in terms of our researchers. And so any sort of way that you can give would be terrific. We'd really appreciate sort of the support. Obviously, big stuff like scholarships so that kids can really, I say kids, sorry, but young people sort of can join in terms of sort of training and not have that additional sort of educational burden, because those that are sort of disadvantaged are really within our umbrella in terms of underrepresented. That can sort of make a difference in terms of helping. So there's lots of ways to give, small, medium, and large. I think the piece is that we need your help, and your help can really make a difference in terms of lots of different ways that we're trying to get talent, keep them here, and have them really thrive, be successful, and create sort of simply irresistible sort of environments that people are working in.
Thank you so much. Another question, we'd love to hear about how offices within the medical school are working together on this. How is your office working with, for example, Mary Tate's office, the Minority Affairs and Diversity Office, as well as the Office for Admissions?
Great. Great question. So one of the things in terms of coming on board is we've done some restructuring. So under the umbrella of the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Mary Tate and her amazing work, her and with her colleague James Cooper, are joining me in the Office of Diversity. So OMAD, since we love acronyms, OMAD is under ODEI, as is the Center for American Indian and Minority Health is sort of in that, the public, the health disparities research folks, the Center for Women in Medicine, all those folks. We collaborate with our CTSI colleagues for the early career research opportunities and scholars. And so we have sort of a number of folks within that umbrella. That's within sort of the reformulated. But what I'll share with you, and this is the power of change, is it's not silos. It really is a collaboration that you're talking about. And so we collaborate with the Office of Faculty Affairs. We collaborate with our curricular colleagues. We collaborate with Dimple Patel in sort of admissions, as well as our colleagues in Duluth. So we have lots of different sort of dotted lines sort of everywhere in this really matrix way, because that's the only way we're going to get this done. This really is sort of an effort where we're working together in terms of sort of making a difference. So the more that we sort of connect, the more dots there are, the more confusing the org chart is. It means that we're sort of getting the job done well and correctly. So it's important. And, you know, I could spend an hour just talking about OMAD and Mary Tate's work from empowering sort of youth coming into medicine, as well as the CWIM's work with our Office of Faculty Affairs and the work that they're doing in terms of gender equity evaluations. So there's a lot of stuff that's sort of happening, as well as paying attention to sort of COVID fatigue, which, you know, that's a thing. So we work on, and sort of one of the meta messages in the Office of the Diversity Office is really to break down some of those silos and have people sort of working as we have all the talent that comes in, and sort of all the different environments. I sort of say when we talk about an inclusive environment, like which one? Even where you work, there's probably 5 different ones. There's when, you know, there's Mondays and there's Tuesdays, and when you're doing this, what do those different climates look like as we sort of try to influence them and sort of make them get to a better place? So yeah, so we collaborate with lots of folks, but specifically OMAD and Mary Tate and James Cooper, they're part of sort of the ODEI umbrella, and I'm delighted to have them sort of as collaborators in terms of this work.
That's great. Thank you so much. You mentioned the Office for Faculty Affairs collaborator. What is currently being done to recruit more faculty, more Black, Indigenous, people of color into faculty positions?
Great question. So one of the things that I started when I first came here was kind of a listening tour, talking to senior leaders and departmental chairs and institute directors in terms of where their perspectives were about sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And one of the things that I actually asked everybody is not only about recruitment, but who do they invite to come and talk? Are they being intentional when they bring in their grand round speakers, when they bring in sort of their visiting professors, that they find experts who are also diverse? And so to pay attention to that, because if you don't pay attention to that, then we keep reproducing the same thing over and over and might be unintentionally exclusionary. We do have opportunities for people that are in the research intensive track for something called the Early Career Research award. And what that award is it provides covered time, support, and a research base for individuals with a wraparound of a pretty cool curriculum that helps people that are either pre-K or in the K track, so they not only can be successful getting their K award, but can also get their T award, and then create an infrastructure that has sort of lots of R1s that keep them sort of well-funded moving forward. That enables them to sort of find mentors and get in teams that can be productive and in sort of a reasonable amount of time, be able to become independent sort of principal investigators on their own. So those are sort of elements. I've also worked with sort of all the chairs as they're sort of talking with, potential recruits who may sort of want to hear about what we're doing in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm sort of available in terms of sort of being a resource, as well as sort of connecting individuals so far as that. So we're out there sort of looking. So if you know anybody who's interested in sort of engaging, please send them our way, because we'd love to chat in terms of looking for sort of opportunities as we sort of move forward. There's lots of different and interesting spaces to work and to make a difference here at the university. And so let us know, because we're looking for folks in terms of sort of engaging.
Terrific, thank you. So we have a little bit more time. If alumni have any questions they'd like to ask, feel free to type that into the question and answer, the Q&A box. And if we don't have any, then we can end a little bit early. But I would like to, I just want to make sure people have the opportunity to ask a few questions if they want to.
And also, if you want to put in the chat, what are things that we can do from our Office of Diversity that would be helpful to you?
It's a great idea. So while we're waiting to see if we get any suggestions for you, I just want to thank you very much for the presentation. And actually, it looks like we've just gotten another question. So years ago, this physician was serving on the UMP board, and they had a national recruitment team who did not include a person of color or females in the finalists. This shows how important it is to hire recruiting firms with a positive history.
It's a great point. As a matter of fact, it's important not only when you hire these recruiting firms, that if you say to them square one, we want to have sort of diverse individuals in the pool, and they come back to you not doing that, to hold them accountable and say, go back to the drawing board. That's really what we want. So it's really important to be able to sort of basically get your money in terms of these recruiting firms, to have them do the job that you ask them to do, because it's important in terms of recognizing that. It is important to also note, though, that in sort of our diverse fields, the number of individuals who are BIPOC vary a great deal. The number of full professors in ophthalmology is not going to be the number of full professors in family medicine or general medicine. So it varies depending on sort of that specialty. And so that speaks to the issue that not only do we need to recruit people, but we also have to sort of sponsor people, find individuals who have that talent and just needs the support to be able to sort of get to that next step, and provide that support so that we can sort of help move the needle in terms of sort of that development. There's a question, can we share that student curriculum from Duluth? I will absolutely ask them and find out, Dr. Richards. So Maureen, if you can sort of just write that down for me so we can sort of find out about that. I have actually invited them to consider sort of writing it up because I just thought it was such a cool student-generated action to an immediate thing. And I think that they're in the middle of that as well as sort of studying for boards. The students working on that are sort of trying to do that, but we'll try to find some more information so you can understand about that curriculum.
I have made note of that for you.
Thank you. I will let you know that in terms of sort of UMP specifically, they are in the process of recruiting a director for diversity, equity, and inclusion so that that person aligning with me and sort of our work can both work in terms of sort of our health systems as well as sort of the School of Medicine as we align as well with the university so that it's not like you walk in one door and here's what we do and you walk in another door and it's different. So we're really trying to sort of have this sort of be aligned so we're talking with each other. How do you make progress to help large numbers of young disadvantaged students the skills needed to be successful? Dr. Gilbert, what a fabulous question. So, I think that somebody earlier had talked about how do we do advocacy, right? And perhaps one of the elements of advocacy is using your influence and leadership to sit on PTAs or school boards and talk that sort of there is a distribution of resources to train people where they live so that underrepresented students go to places that have a place, maybe not third base, but at least second base in terms of sort of the ability to be able to have sort of opportunities to move forward. And so I think that that can help move things much earlier. There's lots of really important studies that show that with youth, kids, and some of you said you're in pediatrics, so you know about this better than I do, but children, when they see somebody in a role, say, oh, I met you, I have a relationship with you, maybe I can do that. And so literally the getting out in the community instead of talking with some of these students, now maybe in the virtual space, virtually being with students in terms of sort of sharing your story and your journey can be really empowering. And developing a relationship in terms of how they're moving forward. We are working in terms of various pipeline programs. We want to sort of develop a lot of them, but we need linkages in terms of sort of making those connections. But this ranges from something that you can do in terms of sort of being on sort of a board where you're advocating in terms of resources for education to just going to a school and sort of talking about sort of what you do or inviting them in terms of sort of shadowing whenever we can do that in a socially distancing way and sort of being sort of role models. That's really powerful. If you add that with just continuing on that relationship, checking in on them and how they're doing, that can be really influential. And for all of you who mentor, I'm not telling anything you don't know. You know how you can really influence the lives of others in a really meaningful way. But when it comes to sort of disadvantaged students, it also comes in terms of resources. If there's resources where we can have sort of opportunities for kids to be able to get additional training to be able to make up for some of the disadvantages that they had. You'd be surprised. I had a student once a number of years ago, and she was in our pre-med sort of graduate program previously where I was working. And this gal went to a school district that during high school, they just shows entertainment films during science class. And when the students said, can't we do some science in science class? They're like, and they did one lesson plan and then went back to showing sort of entertainment films. She went to college at a competitive school and didn't do well because everybody understood basic principles in science that she'd never heard of, and she was trying to play catch up. But that individual, in terms of a graduate session, within 2 years, was able to make up the time in terms of being successful and competitive for medical school. And so, there's lots of talent out there, and you all are good at being talent scouts, cultivating them, directing them to resources, donating some funds to support for scholarships, training programs, and opportunities for them to sort of see what the world can be, have that light bulb go off. They could have a career that looks like yours, that they could engage into new discoveries. It's really powerful. But it takes effort, it takes time, it takes giving to be able to do that. But that's how we start it and then sort of build and sort of mentor in terms of going there. But thank you, that's a great question.
Any final questions for Dr. Núñez today? I want to thank you so much, Dr. Núñez, for sharing how the medical school is moving forward and committing to change with this work. It's so vitally important, and we're very glad to have you as part of the collaborative team that's working on this. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I will remind everybody that this session has been recorded, and the recording will be available on the Alumni Celebration website pretty soon. With our final thanks to Dr. Núñez, we hope to see you on another webinar this week.
Thank you, everyone. It was great sort of chatting with you, spending some time. I look forward that we at some point can do the in real life thing. Thanks for all you do. And please have a wonderful week. Take care.
Thank you.